Well, today we're going to start with another section, and this would be called lesson number 7, Jesus' invitations. Well, Jesus first addresses a group of people which he was very familiar with, his own family. You know, when you talk to your family, you know, you expect them to be supporting, and you expect them to give you good advice. Well, not always. This is in John chapter 7 and 8, but we will not get into chapter 8 probably. But John 7 and 8, they go together because the subjects in John 7 are covered in John chapter 8. Only they are in reverse order in John chapter 8. But we're going to look at John chapter 7 today. Well, we know that Jesus did have a family. Mary was not a perpetual virgin. Mary had other children. We see this in Matthew 13:55. Matthew 13:55. This is what it says. Is not this the carpenter's son? Is not his mother called Mary? And are not his brothers James and Joseph and Simon and Judas? Well, I think it's interesting that I'm a carpenter. I did carpentry full time for about 12 years, and so I've done a lot of different things, and I have been a carpenter. I was a contractor for several of those years, about 7. Well, here we are. You know, we got right behind me a bunch of saws. Here's my back saw. Then I got a couple squares and a couple other saws there. Well, there's quite a discussion with Jesus' brothers. We have them named here, some of them at least: James, Joseph, Simon, and Judas. There in Matthew 13:55. This also, in this passage, it shows us that this discussion was among unbelievers. Jesus was the believer. Jesus was the one that really was from God. Jesus came down from heaven. Some of Jesus' own disciples may have not become believers until later in the Bible. We see this in John chapter 6, and that several of his disciples left him because they didn't believe in Jesus' philosophy. They didn't believe in Jesus' way of doing things. It says that several of his disciples left him. Now, the word disciple does not just mean the 12 men, Jesus' 12 followers, or Jesus' 12 learners. The word disciple means learner. Some of them stopped believing in him, you might say, or they did not support him. Some of these disciples. Well, Jesus' own brothers did not support him either. We're going to see that as we look deeper into John chapter 7. So let's look at John chapter 7, verses 1 and 2. John chapter 7, verses 1 and 2. After this, Jesus went about in Galilee. He would not go about in Judea because the Jews were seeking to kill him. Well, he had a good reason for staying out of Judea. After this, Jesus went about in Galilee. Galilee was the area around the Sea of Galilee. And it says that the people in Judea were very opposed to Jesus' ministry. They didn't like it because Jesus was competing with them. He was gathering more disciples than they had. Well, it talks about the feast also in verse 2. Now the Jews' feast of booths was at hand. In some translations it calls it the Feast of Tabernacles. What does that mean? Well, the word tabernacle means a type of temporary shelter. This Feast of Booths is even celebrated by modern day Jews. They will go down to Home Depot or some home improvement store, buy materials, and just use 2x4s or something like that and put up some sort of temporary shelter to symbolize the type of shelter that was built in the wilderness by the Jewish people thousands of years before. Well, this is one of the three feasts that the Jews were supposed to be at. Jesus, being a good Jew, he was obedient to the law of Moses. So he was there at this Feast of Booths, or the Feast of Tabernacles. Booths is spelled B-O-O-T-H-S. And it's just a temporary shelter. In verse 1, it says, after this. Well, what is that talking about? It's talking about the events after chapter 5 and verse 18, where Jesus claimed to be God. Well, Jesus' brothers made plans for Jesus. First, the brothers of Jesus thought Galilee was too quiet an area. They told Jesus, leave here. Let's look at John chapter 7, verse 3. So his brothers said to him, leave here and go to Judea, that your disciples also may see the works you are doing. Well, they wanted Jesus to be famous. They wanted people to see the good works that he was doing, the miracles that Jesus was doing. As I said, in John, there are three words for miracles. Number one is signs. John most of all calls them signs. S-I-G-N, signs. Next was the word miracles itself. And then lastly is the word works. All these refer to the miracles that Jesus had done. They thought that Jesus' main priority would be to get them out of the fix they were in, because the disciples and Jesus' brothers were in an occupied country. Israel was occupied by the Romans. They thought Jesus should display his great works. They wanted Jesus to be a showman. They wanted him to be a magician. They meant Jesus' signs that he was doing. That's what they mean by works. But isn't that just like the world? They are looking for a show, or they think Jesus should impress people. Jesus brought this to mind when he says that the brothers were a part of the world. What does that mean? What did Jesus mean by that? Well, we'll look at that. They were looking for a show, or they thought Jesus should impress people. You know, people today are always trying to impress each other, aren't they? They even have TV shows about it. Well, like the disciples in Acts, they thought the Messiah should set up his kingdom and get rid of the Romans. The Romans were occupying the land of Israel. If we go back to the book of Acts, we're going to see what Jesus' disciples really thought of the Messiah. Let's look at Acts chapter 1. Acts chapter 1. In verse 6. Acts chapter 1 and verse 6. So when they had come together, they asked him, Lord, will you at this time restore the kingdom to Israel? He said to them, it is not for you to know the times or seasons that the Father has fixed by his own authority. You see, they wanted Jesus to set up his kingdom. Maybe they were thinking that maybe they would be part of the kingdom that Jesus would set up. Jesus would be the king, they would be his subjects, but maybe they thought, well, we'll get really hefty incomes for being the advisors to Jesus. Maybe this is something of what the brothers of Jesus thought, that they would be his advisors, his advisory committee. They would be the first family, part of the first family. Well, Judea is the place of Joseph's birth. I don't know if you realize that, but Joseph, his main city that he came from was Bethlehem. You remember Bethlehem was the place where Mary and Joseph had gone to pay their taxes. Yeah, they had taxes back then too. And the taxes were really exorbitant. They were very steep for poor people. This is what the brothers were thinking, that Jesus should go back to the capital of Judea and set up his kingdom. Maybe that's what their plan was. Well, like the disciples in Acts, they thought the Messiah should set up his kingdom. Jesus' brothers suggested that Jesus would impress the world. It was because too much of the world was in Jesus' brothers. Jesus talks about this in verse 4. John chapter 7 and verse 4. For no one works in secret. This is the brothers speaking to Jesus. For no one works in secret if he seeks to be known openly. If you do these things, show yourself to the world. They thought this opportunity of the Feast of Booths in Israel, in Jerusalem, was a chance for Jesus to show his power. And so they said, show yourself to the world. Well, Jesus didn't like their plan. Since Jesus' brothers were so much a part of the world, Jesus says that the world didn't hate them. Let's look at chapter 7, verse 7. This really explains the condition of the brothers of Jesus. The world cannot, this is Jesus, he's speaking to his brothers. The world cannot hate you, but it hates me because I testify about it that its works are evil. Well, the world cannot hate you. Now, what do I mean by the world? What does this particular verse mean by the world? Is it talking about the globe? People today believe that if they're taking care of the environment, that they're morally superior. And I believe that there should be conservation of the world's resources. There's nothing wrong with that. But you see, today, instead of a morality that comes from the Bible, people today believe that their morality comes from the worldly philosophy. The world philosophy. What is the world philosophy of today? Well, You see young people today being very individual. Today, you're supposed to be your own person. You're supposed to just be what you want to be. That is the worldly philosophy of today. And there's nothing wrong with being your own person, being what you want to be. There's nothing wrong. There's nothing sinful at all about that. But you see, it goes to the next level. Because people think that their morality, their philosophy, their worldly, world-centered philosophy is built on the philosophy that the other members of the world have. That it is superior to God's philosophy, God's plan, God's ideas. God's ideas are found in the Scriptures. The Scriptures today, by the majority of the world, are rejected. They're too strict. Oh, that's an old book. That was written thousands of years ago. It doesn't apply to today. It is just too old. It's an old thing. Well, sorry to say this, but it isn't old-fashioned. It is up to date. It talks about sexual immorality. It talks about stealing. It talks about lying. Aren't those part of the world's philosophy? You know what people believe today? They believe that it's okay to lie and cheat and steal as long as you're doing it to people who deserve it. You see, that isn't what God's philosophy is. God's philosophy is to be honest, to be good, all the time, 24/7, every day, because you will have a good family, you will have a good family life, you will have a nice group of children who respect you and respect your husband or wife. And by the way, a husband and wife should respect marriage. This produces a solid, there have been studies that have been done that show that a husband and wife who are committed to each other produce stable children. Today, the philosophy is, let's produce as much instability as we can. This man, he finds another woman. This woman, she finds another man. People today are looking for a soulmate. They aren't looking for someone who's halfway decent and a good person. They aren't looking for someone who's godly, who believes in the Bible, who raises their children to respect God and Jesus and to believe in Him. In our passage here in chapter 7 and let's go back a couple chapters to chapter 5. This is part of the context of chapter 7. Let's go back to chapter 5 and verses 24 and 25. John chapter 5, verses 24 and 25. Truly, truly, I say to you, whoever hears my word and believes him who sent me has eternal life. Let's just stop there for a second. Whoever believes my word, Jesus said, you have to believe my word. He didn't say, believe my words, plural. No, he said, believe my word. This, dear friends, is the way to have a happy family and a good life. This is the answer for all of your problems. This is the answer for all of my problems. I'm not just a guy who just preaches and doesn't have any problems. All of us do. We need this. This is the way to solve problems. This is what the world needs. Do you think the gunman who shot people at a school recently in Florida, do you think that he needed this in his life if he would have been raised as a Christian young man who was respectful and loving to everyone? Don't you think that he would have had second thoughts? Let's start with verse 24 again. Truly, truly, I say to you, whoever hears my word and believes him who sent me has eternal life. If the world and their philosophy were thrown out the window and thrown where it should be, out of your life, and the world believed, verse 24, we would have a better world. Verse 25, truly, truly, I say to you, an hour is coming and is now here when the dead will hear the voice of the Son of God, and those who hear will live. Whose voice are you listening to? Are you listening to the world's philosophy? Or are you listening to Jesus Christ, the Son of God? Those who hear will live. Do you want to live eternally in heaven? You can. Turn to Jesus Christ. Well, the brothers, what did they want to do? They wanted Jesus to be famous. The world hates us as Christians. And Jesus, they hate also, because we and Jesus condemn their works, their sin. Chapter 7, verse 7. Chapter 7, verse 7, we read it. The world cannot hate you, but it hates me. The world hates Jesus for the most part. In verse 8, it says that Jesus said, I am not going up to this feast. Well, in the King James and the New International Version, Jesus said something different. He says, I am not yet going up to this feast. So Jesus did not want to go to the feast. He told them that he wasn't going. Well, he wasn't going the way they wanted. They wanted him to be a big parade leader, to be famous, to be superior, to show his wonderful works. They were interested in a miracle worker. There is a footnote in the NIV and the ESV. It says earlier manuscripts did not have the word yet. In other words, Jesus said that he was not going to go up to the feast just yet. Well, or at that time, I should say. In verse 10 it says, but after his brothers had gone up to the feast, then he also went up, not publicly, but in private or secret. Jesus wanted to go the back way or to go another way. He didn't want fame or fortune or recognition. Either Jesus changed his mind or he meant that he would not go up to Jerusalem publicly but privately. This is what Jesus was talking about. God can't lie and God can't change his mind. I believe Jesus meant that he would not go publicly, but he would go privately. Well, we're going to continue there with further studies in John. And I hope that you enjoy this. I hope that you will see that you don't need more worldly philosophy. There's a ton of that, and does it work? Well, no, it hasn't worked. It's produced a violent, dangerous society bent on killing each other. But what Jesus wants to provide is a society that loves everyone. and cares about them. I hope that you will have this kind of feeling in your heart.